Hello everyone, and welcome to this, our second big topic talk in the online event series that we are hosting around the redesign of Grosvenor Square. My name is Ed Green. I am a Senior Development Manager at Grosvenor, and I am leading our project to consider the redesign of the square. So falls to me to say a big hello to those of you who are joining us for the first time, and thank you so much to those who are coming back for a second week in a row. Today we are discussing accessing the outdoors and how can we make green spaces easier to get to and easier to move around. So grateful that you've taken the time to join us today, and I really hope you enjoy the session. So as I mentioned, the event is part of the events program that we're conducting as we consider redesigning Grosvenor Square. The square recently returned to Grosvenor's control, and we are looking at ways in which we can invest in the square to make it more suited to the demands of an urban green space in 21st century London. We think that there are lessons that can be learned from this process for other urban spaces in London and beyond. So today we want to think about urban green spaces on a London scale, and then think about what those lessons can mean for Grosvenor Square specifically. The square has a fascinating history, which I thought I'd spend a couple of minutes sharing with you. So it was originally laid out in the 1720s as the heart of the Grosvenor family's new build estate on the western fringes of London. It was one of the first examples of a developer creating a spectacular green space in a new development in order to build a reputation for that area and really to enhance value. It was all about horticulture. It was billed as being a piece of countryside in the city, and it was a huge success and has kind of been the foundations of Mayfairs that we see today. And the square in that form actually didn't last for that long. It was redesigned only about 50 years later, in about 1775. And it was modernised to sort of the changing needs of Georgian society. Can we go to the next slide? There we go. Although it kind of had this new layout, it very much kind of retained its ethos as being a horticultural centerpiece. The middle of the estate, and the planting changed and became larger and less formal, but still kind of very traditional in that time. And it continued to evolve throughout the 19th century, and it had various changes. There were statues that came and went, and the trees were felled and new trees were planted. But really, it kind of changed. It remained very much the same until the war, really. And can we go to the next slide? And so following the Second World War in about 1946, the Duke of Westminster gave over the square to be publicly accessible for the first time. And this dramatically changed the destiny of not only the square, but of Mayfair, really. And along with this, the square was totally redesigned, and you can see that design in this slide here. It really changed to meet the needs of London at the time, and it reflected the national sentiment. It became about memorial and about the British relationship with America. So the square, as we see today, has this kind of long sort of runway through the middle, and with the leading up to the statue of FDR, who'd recently died when they installed this. So really, it was kind of, the square's focus changed from being about horticulture and about the environment to being about memorial, really. And I don't know, I always think this is quite an interesting slide. Oh, sorry, can we go back one? Because this was taken in, I think, about 1954. No, we can't go back one. Yeah, and just as we think about access today, that it really shows that at the time, planning was really all about the car, and the square was really designed to make sure that traffic flowed really well around the square. And I think that perhaps that isn't the priority for modern London these days. But I guess into more recent history, Grosvenor regained the management of the square about 2-3 years ago, and since then we've been thinking about what we can do to perhaps change it, to make it meet the needs of modern London better, and what is required of a public green space for the next 100 years. Great spaces need to be easy to access and easy to move around and safe for everybody. And during the session, we want to explore different ideas for the future of accessing the outdoors in our cities. This is such a timely discussion given how much we're all appreciating the smallest amounts of outdoor space and greenery at the moment. And we want to explore how we can increase the access to the outdoors in a way that is both good for people and for the planet. And what does this mean for Grosvenor Square? So I'm thrilled to introduce 4 wonderful speakers who are going to help us with just that. Firstly, Neil Sinden. Neil is the director of CPRE London, a branch of the Campaign to Protect Rural England, the countryside charity. He is a trustee of the arts and conservation charity Common Ground and has been a trustee of Civic Voice, the umbrella group for local civic societies. And until 2015, he was CPRE's National Director for Policy and Campaigns. Next up, we'll hear from Peter Massini. Peter develops and manages policy on parks, ecology and urban greening for the Greater London Authority, successfully embedding a framework in the London Plan and the London Environment Strategy that aims to make London a greener, more livable and resilient city. We have Phillippa Banister joining us. Phillippa is a director of Streetscape, a social enterprise working with people to reimagine their streets and spaces to make them feel safer, bring joy and social connection. She has a background in theatre, community building and healthy street design, and gets fired up imagining and testing ideas to foster connection in public space. And to complete the panel, we have Fahad Malik. Fahad is from Tonkin, the architects leading the redesign of Grosvenor Square. He graduated from the Glasgow School of Art in 2014 and has extensive experience taking residential and mixed-use projects from conception to completion. And he is currently the project architect for Grosvenor Square. So once again, we'll be helped through the next hour and a quarter or so by Kath and Greg from Make Good. Make Good are helping us facilitate the whole conversation we want to have with everyone who has an interest in the future of Grosvenor Square. So she'll be prompting some discussions with both our speakers and with you, the audience. So please do get involved and share your thoughts in the comment stream. And without further ado, I will hand over to her.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you, Ed, for that introduction, and thank you, audience, for all being here. I'm really excited that we're going to be discussing accessing the outdoors today with such a great panel. If we go to the agenda, just to give you all a shape of today's session, we will start off with a quick question to our panel that will help frame our discussion. And I would like to ask you as audience members to also respond to that question and actually to any of the discussion pieces this evening in the chat function. So if you don't know where that is, it's at the bottom of your Zoom window in the middle. And if you click that, it'll bring up the chat channel on the side and you can put your answers to the questions in there, because we want to know what you also think is important about accessing the outdoors. We're then going to have snappy 5-minute talks from the speakers, followed by a discussion where I'll be putting some questions from you to the panel. So please do pop your questions for them into the Q&A channel, which is also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Don't worry if you put things in the wrong channel. We've got the Make Good team on hand to pick things out and make sure that we can pose those questions to the panel. So, and then finally, we're going to end with what's the learning for Grosvenor Square, because whilst we want to think about this, we want to think about accessing our green spaces in a city-wide scale. We really also want to focus on what does this mean for Grosvenor Square. Right, so the question that I would like us to think about first, both as a panel and as an audience, is what should it feel like to arrive at a great green space? So Peter, Phillippa, Neil and Fahad, I'm going to be coming to you for some answers to that. So, Peter, starting with you, what do you think it should feel like to arrive at a great green space?
I think the first thing is that all of your senses should tell you you've arrived at a great green space. So it's not just a sort of visual experience, it's the audible experience, it's the sense of arriving somewhere which is a different part of the city, but not apart from the city.
Amazing. And Phillippa?
I think it should feel like a bit like you're arriving home, but in a very green and natural home, that you recognise yourself in that green space, and that it feels like very accessible, and however you've managed to get there.
Amazing. Neil, what do you think?
I had a similar response to the one that Peter's just given, really, is that one should feel that sort of stimulated in all the senses of being in a space which provides some kind of relief from the stresses and strains of a busy urban environment, and a space that can give you an opportunity to rest a while, to relax, and to connect with natural surroundings.
Great. It's really nice to see kind of synergy between the answers. Okay, so Fahad, I'm coming to you next.
Yeah, so I kind of agree with that point about relief as well, but I suppose in simple terms, green spaces are kind of moments to pause and reflect, and they should feel accessible and inviting, and encourage people to take ownership. So give them excuses to actually spend a long time there, as well as simply walk through.
Okay, so that's interesting, thinking about the amount of time that we would want to spend in a place. You know, Phillippa, I guess from an aspiration of creating something that's welcoming and inclusive, what do you think that means for the edges of green spaces?
I think it means that people need to have been involved in a process of kind of imagining how that green space works and looks and functions. That would be, yeah, my ideal, I think.
Okay, and Fahad, I guess kind of from an architectural perspective, kind of what do you think that means for the edges?
Well, I suppose the first thing that comes to my mind is maybe the edges and boundaries should be green as well. So the planting and nature actually become more prominent than the boundary mechanism itself, which limits the access perhaps. So that kind of thinking can be combined with sort of marked gateways that are an invitation, but I would focus on making the boundaries green as well as the space itself. Great.
And, you know, I guess, you know, Peter, my question to you would be, you know, if we've thought about what the arrival experience is, then once you're in there, in a space, what should it feel like to be able to move around it easily?
Of course, it depends on the size and context of the space, but I mean, clearly it should have areas of intimacy, so you can almost feel alone in the space. But I think all great spaces also have those moments of reveal as well, so opening up landscapes or particular features of the space as well. So it's quite a difficult trick to pull off, to have that sort of mix of intimacy and then grand reveals.
You know, Neil, you also clearly believe in the power of being outdoors. So would you agree on that experience of moving around?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'd like to add in another kind of challenge, really. I certainly agree that the boundaries and the edges should be, you know, soft and provide a sense of welcoming and an invitation to enter. But at the same time, we're very interested in arguing for better ways of connecting green spaces. So I'm sort of also thinking that we should be easing people into that natural experience as they approach the square.
Fantastic. You know, I'm wondering whether, if I'm hearing correctly, it sounds as though there are kind of three components that we're going to therefore be thinking about today. You know, I guess it's the why is it important to be able to access the outdoors, which is, you know, in response to kind of some of the things that Peter and Neil, that you were saying around those experiences of arriving, you know, linking into what the physical and emotional experience of accessing an urban green space is. You know, Phillippa, I'm really interested in this idea of kind of welcoming that you talked about. And then I guess once you're inside, what that experience is like. So hopefully we're going to be thinking about that across this evening. And as I said before, thinking about it on a city scale, and then specifically what that means for Grosvenor Square. So I think we're all appreciating our local green spaces much more in these times. And there's something really interesting about the role of those smaller scale green urban spaces in terms of providing that escape and that feeling of being outdoors, which I guess speaks to what you just said, Peter, about the size of the space being really important when you're thinking about access. So we're going to move into our talks. First up, we have Neil, who in his role at CPRE is championing a more natural capital with all the benefits that brings to reducing pollution and waste, alongside improving our health and well-being, which aligns perfectly with the aspiration of this project to transform Grosvenor Square into a thriving place for people and planet. So over to you, Neil.
Thanks, Catherine. So, yeah, very briefly, just to give you a bit of background about CPRE London, we are, strange as it may seem, the countryside charity operating within the city. We're working for a greener city, and we're part of a national network of the campaign to protect rural England that operates across the country. And it's interesting that Ed talked about Grosvenor Square being originally conceived as a piece of countryside in the city. And in a way, it's sort of symbolic of the kind of work we're trying to do today across London. Yeah, so we're a campaigning charity. We work across London, and our three sort of core objectives really are around protection of green spaces and their enhancement, the revitalisation of the built environment, and we have a very keen interest in the Healthy Streets agenda here. And we're also interested in how we can promote the engagement of people with and communities with their green spaces and the wider countryside beyond. Moving on, please. For us, and for many people, I think what's vital about London's green spaces network is the so-called protected land that exists in the green belt around the fringes of London, but also the so-called metropolitan open land, which is the dark green on this slide, which is dotted around many parts of inner London and which is meant to enjoy the same level of protection from development as green belt. But of course, within these including these green protected areas, we also have a vast network of smaller green spaces across London, which are vital for the health and well-being of local communities. And we're concerned as much about those as we are about these protected areas. Next slide, please. I also wanted to draw attention to the fact that, and as speakers before have indicated, I think we're more aware of this now than perhaps we were a few months ago in the current circumstances. But there is an existing deficiency of green space across London if you compare the amount of available green space to the population that there is. We only have about 2/3 of the green space that we need for a population the size of London. And this map here from, I think, one of Peter's earlier pieces of work illustrates in the whiter areas where that access to green space is deficient in many parts of London. Moving on, I think it's probably worth also mentioning the recent polling that CPRE has done nationally, which shows that in London, 2/3 of people now are placing a higher priority on the protection and enhancement of green space as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And a half of us are visiting green spaces more, and more than a half are more aware of the importance of green spaces and access to local green spaces for our health and well-being. And I put this slide up, which seems slightly odd, to draw attention to some of the challenges we face with green space management in London. This map here is of Greater London, the bigger map that you can see in the centre here, and is an extract from the larger map to the top, which shows, if you like, the extent of what we call relative tranquility across England, with the darker green spaces in England representing the more tranquil areas and the red spaces being the least tranquil spaces. What this shows, of course, is that much of London is not very tranquil, although there are relatively tranquil parts of London around the fringes, particularly to the southeast and to the north of London. What we're keen to do is to promote the idea of tranquility within the city by effective design and management and use of our existing green spaces. And I think we can probably develop a map on a different scale, which shows that within London we do have some relatively tranquil spaces that people can access and enjoy, perhaps more than others. We did some research a few years ago looking at the impact of traffic noise on London's parks and green spaces, and found rather disappointingly that something like 1/3 of London's parks are intensely disturbed by traffic noise, and we need to do something about that, including, I hope, around Grosvenor Square. Moving on to the final two slides. This slide here illustrates in obviously what is quite a unique case, the Olympic Park, what a difference large-scale planning can do to the benefits that green spaces can bring. These slides are nearly 10 years apart and shows quite how dramatic the change in the landscape has been in this part of London. And finally, as Catherine indicated, if we can move on in the introduction, we are pushing with partner organisations this idea of a more natural capital in a manifesto for the next Mayor of London that we've pulled together. And as part of this manifesto, We're arguing for more green space, for improvements in existing green space, and for recognition of the benefits of more tranquil spaces for the health and well-being of the population. And finally, we have four, in the final slide, we have four key areas where we're looking for action from decision makers across London, from the strategic to the very local scale. And I think in Grosvenor Square, we can hopefully see some action on some of these headings here: reducing pollution, noise pollution from traffic, waste, litter control, securing nature's recovery by developing resilient natural habitats, thinking about climate change and urban warming and how local green spaces can help us cope with that, and focusing, as I say, particularly on the health and well-being benefits that green spaces and effective design of green spaces can bring. So that's all from me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Neil. So much of that resonates with what's going on right now. And in fact, actually, somebody's already asked a question, which we will come back to in the panel discussion at the end, about, you know, in Grosvenor Square's specific situation, that actually it's surrounded by so much traffic. And that kind of really, that point that you made around the, you know, the pollution and also the noise impact that can be, that happens when you're surrounded by traffic. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing for us to discuss in the panel piece. So next we're going to hear from Peter about some of the policies that support access and the importance of thinking about whether we are encouraging people to arrive by modes other than car. Again, particularly pertinent for Grosvenor Square, not that I think that people are necessarily arriving there by car, but the arrival experience is dominated by the fact that you've got all these roads around its edges. So over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Catherine. So I'm Peter Massini. I work for the Greater London Authority, and my work covers our policy and programs around green infrastructure, which covers parks, trees, ecology, nature conservation. I'll talk a little bit about how we're trying to create a policy framework which hopefully will try to address some of these issues that we're discussing today. I guess the first thing to say is that we're trying to do this in the context of a growing city. London's a growing city, it's continuing to grow, and we're trying to resolve the conflict between a growing, a denser city whilst maintaining that access to green space and even making London even greener. And it seems a bit of a conundrum, but I think the policy framework we're putting in place will address that. We'll actually make London a greener city, despite the fact it may become more dense. So next slide, please. I guess the first thing to point out is that we're already seeing a fundamental shift in thinking around parts of the public realm. And that's most apparent when we start thinking about London's road space, street space, increasingly in central London in particular, shifting the balance between motor traffic to more pedestrian and cycling. And this is one of the proposed greenways, quiet ways in central London, showing a road much reduced to traffic and creating more space for cyclists and pedestrians. And that's a programme of work that's ongoing at the moment. But I think what this slide does also demonstrate is that perhaps we're not thinking about it really in a completely holistic way, because although the street space has been rethought and redesigned, the park next door is still very much in its very traditional format. Some people may like that, may want that space to be protected as a historic space, but I think we can think differently about the entirety of the public space going forward. Next slide, please. So we've already got a framework in place to help address this. So things like the Mayor's London Environment Strategy and the Mayor's Transport Strategy has already begun to put a framework together which is focused around things like active travel, healthy streets, the concept of green infrastructure, about an interconnected network of parks and green spaces, and greening of the built environment to take a much more joined up holistic approach. So that framework's in place, and actually the current lockdown and the issues that COVID-19 has highlighted hopefully will only accelerate that transition to a sort of greener, more resilient London in the future. Next slide, please. But it does mean we have to address some areas of potential conflict. The classic one being how the existing green space network can become part of the active travel network. So the green space network becomes part of that pedestrian cycle network across London. At the moment, there's quite a lot of conflict around there because there's a sense that the parks and green spaces should be free from that flow of cycle traffic and pedestrian traffic. But if we are going to have envision a sort of different city, a city which that does promote a lot more active travel, we're going to have to resolve some of the planning and design issues around allowing more cycling and walking between and through parks, connecting that network up so it becomes a holistic network of green spaces and active travel networks. It also provides a justification for more investment in those green spaces. If it becomes part of the infrastructure of the city, there's a much stronger case for that long-term investment in the parks and green space network. Next slide, please. And we're beginning to do this already. This is a number of small schemes that we've implemented, or TfL have implemented, beginning to rethink the existing street space. So this was a dead-end street in Tower Hamlets in Bethnal Green, was originally a street with car parking, antisocial behaviour, not a particularly desirable space. And as part of some of the urban green initiatives that TfL and GLA brought forward, turning it into a civic space that makes it part of that integrated active travel network. The building on the left is actually a civic centre, and now there's a civic outdoor space which people can use as an outdoor gathering space for the civic centre as well. So it's about rethinking and reconfiguring the wider public realm. Looking back at this project, I think one thing, sorry, let's go back to that previous slide. One thing we didn't really think about is the integration of that new civic space, again, with the park next door. There's still the demarcation between the public realm, the civic space, and the green space by my biggest bugbear, which is railings. And the next slide, please. So we need to think about how we actually create a much more seamless integration and transition from street to civic space to green space. And clearly railings and fences have got their place. You can't have just uninterrupted travel and egress between those spaces. But at the moment, I think we've got the balance wrong. Too many parks and green spaces feel fenced off, they feel separate, and actually need to be integrated into the built environment. A lot of colleagues of mine are very worried about that. They think that we're inviting development into the parks and green spaces, whereas I see it as the other way around. We're actually inviting the green space to spill out into the urban environment, and particularly where we've got roads and the streets around parks, thinking about that space becoming civic space, walking and cycling. So you actually enlarge the notion of the park rather than restricting it by encroachment onto the park. Yeah, so that's me. So just some thoughts around how we're beginning to rethink and reconfigure public space, civic space, and green spaces. Thank you.
Peter, it's really useful for us to think about some of the practical things that we need to get right. I would like to ask you to just a couple of minutes more with you, just to kind of say what you mean by creating a network of green spaces.
So we have a really good network of green spaces, but they're spaces that have been protected through the planning system. So London's planning system is pretty good at protecting parks and green spaces, but they end up becoming isolated spaces. So we very much think about parks as defendable spaces, which we defend from development, which is right and proper. We need to do that. But I'm thinking more about how we connect those spaces up by thinking about the street network in between as potential linear parks. You know, again, particularly as we move away from thinking about streets more as public realm, civic space than thoroughfare, we can actually start identifying which streets can become green streets or even linear parks, connecting up the existing network of parks and green spaces. And again, it's something which the current lockdown has really brought into sharp focus, that although people are using the parks, a lot of people haven't got easy access to a nearby park. and they need some sort of public realm, green public realm, literally on their doorsteps. And I think we can start moving in that direction by liberating some of the streets network into and converting it into greener public realm.
Fantastic, thank you. That's really useful. So Phillippa is now going to talk to us about access from the perspective of feeling permission to enter, feeling welcome in a place. Interestingly, in some of our initial conversations with residents around Grosvenor Square, this idea of it being welcoming, or that you should feel welcome there, comes up a lot. And I think it's really interesting for us to think about, well, how does that physically manifest, but also what are some of the kind of invisible barriers that are created by making some place not feel particularly welcome. So I think Phillippa is going to talk to us about how we can use local insight and working with people, including young people who are so often excluded from our public spaces, to get this to happen. Thank you, Phillippa.
Thanks, Catherine. So yes, I'm Phillippa Banister, and I come from a kind of very much a people-focused community development background, and only really started kind of discovering the power of streets and public spaces about 8 years ago, and sort of really lived by Fred Kent's quote about the street being the stage where public life takes place. And I think that kind of really bleeds into sort of green spaces as well. And this is the space that we have to share. And how does that sharing happen, and how is that really equitable? So Street Space is a social enterprise. We work in Barking and Dagenham, and we're all about kind of reimagining streets and spaces with people to make sure that they feel safe, bring joy and social connection. So next slide, please. So yeah, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some experiences and stories around Valence Park, which is a large green space, but sort of very much underused in the Becontree estate in Dagenham. And we were sort of brought in to try and play an activator role to understand how we can engage with local residents and local organisations to really boost both social and physical activity in the park. So really we start off, as with all projects, really just focused on building relationships and listening. So bringing people together to sort of have picnics in the park, going around to local community centres. You can see on the right-hand side, this is a mental map that someone's drawn. And very fascinating detail level really that people pick up, that they need to go past a barking dog, a car wash, which all the bubbles go all over the pavement, and they have to step through sort of like a wet pavement to get to the park. Not sort of being like serious barriers, but just kind of that really very micro level detail, which kind of people notice, and it's fascinating and really rich to kind of tap into that. And I'm sure that you'll be doing that in Grosvenor Square. I'm not sure who lives around there, probably extremely expensive, but just like sort of emphasizing, the real depth and insight that can come from that local engagement, which is sometimes not included. So we're also all about kind of how people feel in a space, especially if it's kind of not being very well used. So asking people what their dreams are, both sort of like in terms of an individual perspective, but also for their community, for their neighborhood. And this is a picture from, we did a sort of Candy Chang inspired chalkboard in the park. So before I die, obviously sort of people weren't answering just about the park, but it's kind of just a sort of notion about permission to imagine things differently. Many people we spoke to had never been asked what their dreams were before in any situation of school or community setting. And so just kind of trying to kind of open up possibilities, both at all different levels, and listening to what people come up with. So some people gave us some feedback about wanting to have taster sessions run by basketball, sort of local stars. So sort of setting that up so that people can kind of get involved with basketball, make friends with new people that they don't usually hang out with. There's quite a lot of conflict in this park relating to different schools and also different age groups, and kind of a lot of insights around people perceiving other people's behaviour as being threatening, or just kind of, yeah, inciting fear in some groups, and trying to find ways to bring different groups of people together and mediate through activity, through doing things together, and just building understanding and trust to sort of help build safety. So the picture on the left is, so there's an outdoor gym that's been installed as part of a resident-led, amazing small-scale regeneration of one small section of the park. And sort of this overlooks a playground, so people are able to exercise whilst they're also watching their children play, which I think, and it's barrier-free, so it's a really like great way to sort of encourage people that don't normally use the gym equipment to use it. Because often in this outdoor gym area, we found that it was just kind of young men at sort of 6 a.m. in the morning or before or after their shift work. And so we spent time kind of recruiting a network of champions who then trained in how to use the equipment, because many people didn't know how to do the different exercises and what that would mean for their, different, what that means in terms of their physical activity each day, and also training them in how to kind of encourage and motivate their peers. Also, as part of this work, we've been looking at the entrances to the park, which I think, yeah, maybe this is not a great example of a welcoming entrance, in fact, extreme opposites. All the entrances to the park look very similar, which results in people kind of not often being able to meet friends at the entrance because they all look so similar, and very unattractive gates, often closed even though that park is actually open at the moment, and rusty railings, very uninspiring ponding, and multiple kind of like access issues. So often what we do is try and, again, bring people together to ask them what they would do differently. So the prompt for this workshop was, if you were holding your wedding in Valence Park, how would you make sure people got there? How would you make sure people knew where they were coming to? Next slide, please. Which led to a few ideas that we're testing at the moment. Around the Becontree estate, there's a lot of kind of no ball game signs. There's lots of mini little green spaces, but they're very much cut off from each other. There's huge amounts of railings and sort of streets lined with lots of pavement parking. It's not very easy to sort of move across despite low volumes of traffic. And so we experimented with putting up this ball games this way sign, just as a nod to kind of, what does a traffic sign look that is actually giving permission rather than sort of saying no to things. And the image on the right is one of the winning entries from our superhero sign design competition with a primary school. And we're going to somehow transform each entrance to the park into a different superhero somehow. Kind of quite a playful, and I'm sure some designers out there are thinking that's a terrible idea, but just trying to really humanize and make the park entrances different and really characterful and really playful in a way to really kind of encourage people to use them. Next slide. Yeah, so just kind of to sum up, really, I think it's really important to focus on what's strong locally, not what's wrong, but kind of who's using the park, who isn't using the park, what other spaces are people using, how can you connect the dots and kind of, and people, and so whether there's, a real passion for a particular type of food cooking or food growing or particular, all sorts of, or mending bikes, or, how can this space accommodate unusual or radical different kinds of uses, if that's what, people might be interested in locally, and explore things from different perspectives, and try and encourage a culture of permission where people can feel they can really take ownership of a space and for it to be theirs. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you, Phillippa. I know that your work is in a really different context to Grosvenor Square, but I think there's something so important for us to think about, those invisible barriers that can be created. But I loved your idea about permission, what helps people to feel permission and to think about the future or change of a space in a new way. And I know that that's something that Tonkin, Lou and Grosvenor are really interested in is that how can we imagine a totally new future for Grosvenor Square that feels appropriate for the 21st century. So now that we've thought about the why, some of the practical considerations and the emotional ones, Fahad is going to be talking to us about some of the physical components of access, the thresholds, the gateways, and ways that you can move around once you're inside. So over to you, Fahad.
Thanks, Catherine. Just to sort of, if you go to the next slide, just to sort of touch on the work of the practice. We sort of strive to create designs inspired by nature. So we spend a long time talking about the sun, the rain, or the wind in relation to architecture, and all three as well. So this is an image from Sun Rain Rooms, which is a sort of an extension project at the back of our office. So if you go to the next slide, just to go back to this sort of 18th century depiction of Grosvenor Square, I think it's quite interesting in relation to boundaries. So what you can start to see is actually it's quite formal. So there's this oval fence and there's a series of control gateways. And they kind of encourage you towards this highly rational promenade. And then if you go to the next slide, you can see the current entrance. This is from the 1947 redesign. So this is the current entrance last weekend on Saturday. So there's some people kind of flouting social distancing there, but you can start to see it's kind of a bit more enclosed, but we still have this curious spiky railing and gate. So it's quite a good prompt to start thinking about actually, what does the idea of entrance mean? Or can that be a bit more poetic as well? So if you go to the next slide, we can see a different kind of boundary at Leicester Square. And this is perhaps a bit more inviting because first of all, we can see actually the fence is set into the vegetation. So you actually notice the planting before you notice the fence. And then secondly, that boundary is integrated with seating as well. So the planting and the fence, that kind of gives people a sense of enclosure and invites them to kind of pause at the seating. And then if you go to the next slide, this is quite a good image to start kind of talking about how we move around green spaces as well. So this is a 17th century garden in France. And it has a series of curving paths and dramatic terraces. And it's encouraging you to move up as well as down. And it has to do that really creatively because actually the only material it's using is plants. So it relates to the idea that if you give ourselves a constraint, it almost forces us to be a bit more creative. And I think those ideas are really important when we start thinking about green spaces, as well as paths and green gateways. And if you go to the next slide, so again, on the idea of gateway, this is a sort of woodland cemetery in Sweden, and it's kind of showing us actually ideas around gateway are as much to do with symbolism as they are about the practicalities of kind of how you lock it and so on, right? So if you look at examples from vernacular architecture and temples and gardens, gateways simply mark the moment when you open out to something. So with that in mind, if you go to the next slide, this is sort of Bryant Park in New York. So these kind of pavilions in the corner mark an entrance. So simply just marking the gateway and inviting people to enter a green space. And if you go to the next slide, this is a pavilion in Japan. So this was to do with kind of exploring modern man's connection with nature. But again, it's an interesting prompt because actually by raising the walls 5 meters high, the pavilion kind of temporarily encloses people before opening them out towards nature. So again, it's relating back to the idea of layering and creating a sense of arrival. And if you go to the next slide, this is a park in France. So another strategy of kind of temporarily enveloping people in a darkness before exposing them to a light or to an entrance in the natural world. So I think all of those images are starting to talk about similar ideas that actually a gateway or a threshold seems to work quite well if you temporarily enclose people before you open them out to something. And if you go to the next slide, this is one of the images we've been discussing. So kind of it's quite a good prompt to talk about the idea of access to outdoor space can mean kind of going above and below as well as across. But I think it's also quite a good prompt to talk about kind of survival and connection to water. So these are amazing structures that you get all over South Asia, but that connection to water is really important. So some people might be aware, that idea that in actually public realm, people feel a lot calmer if they can hear a fountain. And it's because being able to hear running water is related to our survival. So that connection to water becomes really important as well. And if you go to the next slide, this is the Barbican Conservatory. So again, kind of as a typology, the Botanic Garden is so incredibly popular and timeless because actually our connection to nature is inherent. But it's equally interesting. I think I've been making this point that kind of the moment I say Botanic Garden to anyone, we always think of these glass and steel kind of Victorian era structures. But I think so in so many ways, the question for us actually becomes, what does the Botanic Garden of the 21st century look like? And if you go to the next slide, this is a tourist route in Norway among a kind of network of zigzagging pathways and viewing platforms. And again, it's kind of a good prompt to start thinking about shelter, which is as much about creating a moment for people to pause and reflect on nature as much as it is about kind of having things above our heads. And if you go to the next slide, this is the Botanic Garden in Barcelona. So the main goal of this garden is to actually study plant biodiversity. So it offers visitors a really scenic route, and it kind of covers the 5 regions of the Mediterranean. But again, it reinforces the idea that actually our experiences around biodiversity can be educational as well. And if you go to the next image, so I really like this image because one of the really interesting tests for us is actually to note where people stop in the city. And what you find is it's always around these sort of anchors. So whether that's a bollard, a wall we can rest our back to, a small bench. So it's the idea that people in a restaurant always prefer to sit closer to the walls as opposed to the middle because you kind of feel more sheltered and protected. And I think those ideas around enclosure and providing anchors become really important for making outdoor spaces attractive and accessible as well. And I think if we go next. So this is one of the maps we've been looking at, which is quite interesting. So kind of Grosvenor Square was the first oval garden square in London, but if you actually draw a map of the green spaces in London, one of the interesting things we found was these ovals started to appear everywhere, like all across London. And I think it teaches us that the oval garden square typology actually seems to be quite established for London. And I think the other point is on this map is about legibility. So actually, if you put aside Hyde Park and Regent's Park for a second, because they're very legible because of their scale, the most legible squares are maybe kind of Leicester Square and Trafalgar Square. I think the reason they're legible is because of functions. So we always think of a multiplicity of functions when we go there. There's always something to do and so on. And if you go to the next slide, I think I'll kind of end on that point. This is kind of a diagram of a floor plan of the Agora in ancient Greece. And I think it relates back to the point about kind of functions again. So if you look at it, you can kind of see temples and there's civic offices and there's an amphitheater, so there may be events and so on. But the day-to-day function of the Agora was actually nothing to do with any of these things. It was basically a market and a meeting place. So somewhere where you'd meet your friends and socialize and actually engage with the city at a human scale. So accessing outdoor space, it becomes as much about creating beautiful spaces as it is about celebrating these sort of human connections. And I think I'll end there. I hope I didn't overrun.
Thank you, Fahad. That was great, and so much inspiring imagery there from all over the world. Lots of food for thought. So Ed is going to join us now for a discussion. We're going to bring all of the panelists together, and I'm going to put some of your questions that you've been sending in to them. But also, if you have other questions, please do pop them in the Q&A channel, and I will put them to the panel. So I'm going to start off with how the panel think, specifically for Grosvenor Square, like how you can deal with creating a really accessible and amazing green space when actually it's surrounded by so much traffic. So the person who's asked this question has said, what do you do about the fact that it's in the middle of a huge traffic roundabout? So Ed, if you're there, I'm wondering whether you can talk about that first.
I can indeed. Well, I mean, it's a big challenge. I mean, I don't know, people who know Mayfair well will know that the consented position is actually that the west side of the square is due to reopen to traffic as part of the planning permission for the old US Embassy, and you know that I think we feel is probably only going to make things worse. I think there is a lot of space on that road or in the highways that sits between the gardens and the buildings that is currently dedicated to traffic and to cars, and I think that we should be seeking to reprioritize pedestrians in that space. And and there may be an opportunity to increase the amount of green space. And I think that's really exciting. I think it's the way in which you arrive at the square currently is confusing. It's potentially dangerous. It's far from ideal, and I think it's something that we need to look at with the community and with stakeholders and with Westminster.
Peter, I'm wondering whether, from your experience in your work, is there resistance to that kind of shift in the way that street work around our green spaces?
I don't think there's a in principle. I think most people support the idea of the streets around parks becoming more public space than streets. I mean, there are always lots of issues and constraints to explore about what are the connections into those spaces and into those streets, which results in being full of traffic. And but there have been some really good examples of where spaces which were dominated by traffic have now become much calmer civic spaces. So things like the Aldgate Gyratory in the city, where City of London, working with TfL, they did a long study in terms of how to reconfigure that space. It's difficult and challenging because the city has been designed around the car for decades, but there is now, I think, a fundamental shift occurring in terms of reprioritizing space more for pedestrians and cyclists. It will take time to be realised, but certainly that should be the ambition, particularly where you've got squares and public spaces. Use those as sort of foils to make sure that becomes the focus rather than the road network around them.
Fantastic. So, I mean, there's another question that really links onto that around whether it's the role of a civic space in terms of it being the audience of it. So someone has said, clearly as a vast space in the middle of a cosmopolitan metropolis, loving the language here, Grosvenor Square will need to meet the needs of various contingencies, but how can we ensure that the green space continues to provide a relaxing and friendly haven for local residents? So that's somehow about that balance of who is this space for. So Fahad, I'm wondering whether you've got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of touch on the traffic issue as well, I think that kind of, just in simple terms, I think the answer in there, from my point of view, seems to be more green and less tarmac, which I don't think is that controversial. The whole city for cars mentality is maybe, I don't know, half a century out of date now. And I think in terms of a square encouraging multiple uses, I think one of the things we actually had discussed in the office, which I found really inspiring, was this idea of taking a meandering walk through the forest and then kind of like reaching a clearing. And I think when we think about experiences in nature, we can all relate to walking through a forest or reaching a clearing or stopping by a valley or stopping by a river. And I think garden squares have an opportunity to really design those in. And the reason I mentioned like the valley or the clearing or stopping by a river or so on is actually that's the moment you pause. So as long as there's a moment for people to pause and relax and take that moment to reflect, that's how you cater to the everyday kind of residents of the square, also attracting people from all over the city who go there for kind of a rich, biodiverse experience.
I mean, Phillippa, I'm wondering whether from your experience there is always that kind of balance between who a space is for, and actually it doesn't matter your proximity to a space. Actually, we all, for any kind of space, there's always a range of audience and how you balance those needs.
Yeah, I think one of the first things is to really understand who is using the space at the moment, and whether that, I mean, I think it is important if there is the kind of estates nearby and they're noticeably missing from that space. It's really important to understand why that is, where people in those kind of, where are they going for their space or green space, and why is it not Grosvenor Square, or just trying to understand and kind of get a sense of through observation and through like quite rigorous analysis of who's currently using the space and who's missing from that space.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I think that sense of, and I guess that's going to be part of our role, is understanding who's part of the conversation and who's not part of the conversation, because actually you can create barriers, these invisible barriers, simply through the way in which a space is constructed. So I'm gonna link together a couple of questions now. So someone has asked, what sort of place does Grosvenor Square want to be? I mean, interesting, because I think there's probably lots of people who think it already is a space, and it works, you know, people are using it. And then I'm going to link that together with a point around that the squares of central London are a consistent typology, and it isn't appropriate to try and change the character within a conservation area without very careful deliberation. So, you know, it's that challenge of what change means. So Neil, I guess with your perspective of thinking about trying to expand the role of our kind of green spaces, what change means in that context?
Oh, it's a really interesting couple of questions, and you know, I like the question of what does the space itself want to be. This idea of the space itself having an agency in this process is an interesting one, and it brings us back to, if you like, nature's recovery, I think, to an extent, and the extent to which you know, certain types of plants and trees can thrive in the kind of context that we're wanting to use them in. And I think that really needs to be carefully thought through, also in the context of, you know, the changing climate, and as I say, particularly the urban heat island effect, which I think is going to become quite a significant factor in the way in which we decide to kind of remodel, reshape, and manage green spaces within inner London in a relatively short space of time. So I think that's fascinating. I'm also interested in the idea of you know, who are we catering for here? I mean, obviously, I recognise that we're talking about a kind of a diverse community and a diverse range of stakeholders, but fundamentally, we're talking about people and what people want. And I don't think there's an awful lot of difference in terms of what we all want to see in our experience of the urban environment. And I think that is changing before our eyes with the current crisis, and also I think with the kind of drive that you know, recent mayors have put behind this this idea of promoting active travel, of reducing dependency on the private car, and creating, you know, much more livable, more healthy inner city environments. And then that's about dealing with air pollution and noise pollution, which, you know, effectively are driving considerations when it comes to traffic management in central London. And I think that needs to be sorted out first. And that needs a bigger vision, I think, from the councils, from Westminster and from surrounding councils, and the kind of thing that CPRE London and other partners like London Living Streets and the London Cycling Campaign are joining forces together on, to push councils to be much more proactive and ambitious about managing the car effectively and creating more livable, more hospitable, more healthy places in which people can relax and experience the joy of nature within the city. So those are my kind of thoughts in relation to those quite interesting questions.
Fantastic. I mean, I think you're right that actually a lot of the time when we've started initial conversations about Grosvenor Square, this idea of it being a haven or it being tranquil and a place to relax comes up time and time again, but also this point around noise. So how it currently you know, sound like the noise of cars moving around, and how you could shift that, the way that it sounds, or your experience of noise in the square. Ed, I'm going to come to you because I think you're going to have something interesting to say on this notion of, you know, is this about actually changing character, you know, within a conservation area, or is it about enhancing a character that's kind of, that was there, maybe got lost a little bit, and about bringing it back?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because, I mean, we were lucky enough when we kind of started this process a year or two ago to go and have a look at lots of the London squares and the private ones and the public ones, and see what works well and what doesn't. And, you know, I agree there is a consistent typology, but actually they're quite high level principles. They're about haven and about, you know, greening and about somewhere, a point of respite. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of variation amongst them. I think particularly along the public squares. I'm sure someone will tell me I've got this wrong, but you know, from what we saw, the vast majority of central London squares have been redesigned in the last 60 years, and they've all been done pretty much on the public purse. And as a result, they've all been done, and don't get me wrong, obviously design to manage is one of the most important things that we need to think about as stewards of this space, but design to manage on a shoestring is not what we should be seeking to achieve here. And I think that, you know, there's space to change and evolve the square so it retains that really important sense of haven and creates respite for visitors and residents and workers, but it actually offers more and creates a space that actually, you know, is for people and nature. And that, you know, at the moment there is no space for plant life and animal life to thrive in Grosvenor Square, and there's limited, although there's lots of space, there's limited scope for different experiences within Grosvenor Square. And I think that we can, you know, I think we can keep what's most important and retain that core typology of the square within the conservation area, respecting the heritage, the many years of heritage. I think at the moment we're only looking at kind of one layer that actually has been there for a relatively short period of time. The square is nearly 300 years old, and can we kind of peel back some of those layers and bring forth some of that heritage that's more around horticulture and the environment?
I mean, I'm sure this is going to be a conversation that we pick up in other talks as well, because actually some people have been asking questions about heritage, which isn't necessarily for the access conversation, but definitely a theme to return to, I think. Peter, I think this is one that I'm going to come to you with, to you first. So I guess, you know, linking to your point about how we create a network of green spaces, is it more important to focus on the quality of the existing green spaces, or is it, or should we be thinking about whether we're creating them where they don't exist at the moment, where there might be a deficit? So if we think about, you know, Grosvenor Square at the moment being green space, there are other green spaces around there. Do we also need to focus around, I guess, the edges of it, extending it so that we're improving the quality of that approach experience as well?
Absolutely, I think that's critical. I mean, clearly there's particularly where spaces are managed by local authorities, there's huge constraints in terms of finance and resources to manage those spaces. But some would argue that we should focus our attention purely on the existing spaces. But my view is that if we start thinking about how those spaces link and connect, and you can invest in those connections, that in itself drives the quality of the existing spaces, because they become part of a whole rather than a bunch of separate spaces. And places like Grosvenor Square, they have to operate within the context of the spaces that surround them. So it's as much about thinking about the layout and design and greening of the streets and spaces within the hinterland of Grosvenor Square as Grosvenor Square itself. An interesting conversation with the landscape manager from Lend-Lease, who are redeveloping Elephant and Castle, and they're creating a space within that development. And as a part of the conversations with local communities, they're also thinking about, well, what's the context? If we create this new space in Elephant and Castle, how does that link to a space half a kilometre away? And how can the investment in the space in Elephant Castle, how can we also invest in that other space half a kilometre away, so they become unified spaces? Otherwise you end up with a patchwork of some very high quality spaces, but the links in between are perhaps low quality, or as you leave a high quality space, you might go down a linear park to a low quality space. They've all got to be high quality. So that's again a very difficult thing to pull off, because there's different land ownerships, different funding sources, but we can't end up with a handful of very high quality, highly maintained public spaces connected to a bunch of more mediocre, less well maintained spaces. They've got to be regarded as an infrastructure, just as we regard the road network or the digital infrastructure or the pipe network as an infrastructure that's linked and connected and managed to a certain level of consistency.
Fantastic, thank you. There's an interesting question here about how I'm reading. So how the space connects with, I guess it's in an area where you've also got, Hyde Park and the Palace Gardens. You've got these already big, established, huge green spaces. And so, the question's worded really interestingly in terms of how Grosvenor Square, I guess, competes with the attraction of these spaces, which it doesn't really necessarily need to compete, but it's, it'd be interesting to think about what is the role of Grosvenor Square in the context of these other larger green spaces that people know about. Neil, I'm going to come to you.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it links with what Peter was just saying about the network of spaces and the links between them. And one of the things we've been pushing for with others in this manifesto for the mayoral elections now next year, a more natural capital, is the idea of a network of green walking routes, connecting green spaces across London, radial routes coming out from central to outer London. And we'd be really interested in seeing how one can conceive of a radial green walking route linking, central Westminster through, the surrounding big parks and Grosvenor Square out into Regent's Park and beyond. And this idea of adding value to particular spaces by connecting them better with linear green space is a really fascinating one, and one that chimes very strongly with this, this urgent need to create this sort of modal shift away from cars to more active travel modes. And we'd be very keen to look at how that might work. We're looking at in another part of London, we're looking at a green walking corridor, if you like, from Bishopsgate to the east of the city out to the Lee Valley. And we're calling it the Great Eastern Parks route, which can relatively easily link existing green spaces and add value to them, moving out from the city through Tower Hamlets into Newham. And I'm sure that the same could be done in other parts of London, for example, linking sort of Westminster with Barnet and beyond, through this new kind of strategic green walking network. It's a great idea, and I think something that might help answer the question of the important question of how can Grosvenor Squares, if you like, offer or value proposition kind of differ and add to what's already available in the surrounding areas. Personally, I don't know that part of Mayfair particularly well, but I think this idea of offering a kind of a sense of intimacy, a sense of closer contact with nature, with different kind of habitats. And somebody, I think, in the chat was talking about using a planting strategy which emphasizes the kind of seasonality of the space, and creating a sense of a different experience in different seasons is another interesting one to think about. I think Grosvenor Square has potentially has a lot to offer, and shouldn't be wanting to be bigger than it is in order to sort of be more attractive to passers-by than the bigger green spaces that are nearby.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, interesting as people are unpacking a little bit of what they meant by that in the chat, there's clearly an idea that if we, when we're talking about change, and if we're throwing out lots of different ideas and things that could be improved, and therefore it could feel like actually that this is about putting lots and lots and lots and lots of new things into Grosvenor Square. And actually a conversation that we were having with more immediate residents last Friday, we were definitely talking about the need to retain a sense of openness in some way, and that actually that you can sometimes do access and a feeling of wanting to be in a space a disservice by thinking improvement is about filling it with something, and that actually space is equally important. Fahad, I wanted to come to you about this notion of boundary. So what are the boundaries like at the moment, and is there room for improving them in terms of access?
Yeah, a few ideas come to mind, really. I kind of touched on it earlier, and I think a few other people touched on it as well, how often around green spaces we get these kind of curious spiky fences, and if there's a way to kind of improve that slightly, so maybe the boundaries can be a lot softer and a lot more inviting. And I think, to go back to that previous point, ultimately the kind of smaller garden squares are just about that moment of reflection. So I think there's a design issue there about making the boundary more nature focused to make it more inviting. But I think there's a wider issue there as well when we speak about boundary in terms of, and I do think this kind of applies to the question of access, but kind of wanted to touch on this idea of the perception of Mayfair, because I mean, I might be wrong and this might be a bit cliched, but I certainly think of it as somewhere which is kind of a bit expensive, a lot of embassies, a lot of hotels and so on. And I think actually we also have to start thinking about, how do you make it a space for the residents? How do you make it a space for people who kind of work in the area, but also a diverse range of Londoners as well? So you market as a space where people go to kind of have an experience. So I think when you ask me about boundary, there's definitely the design element of how do you get away from the spiky railing and so on, but also a wider issue of actually how do you attract, because there's a boundary of the area in itself as well, so how do you attract a diverse range of people? And I think, the other point, just to touch on briefly, was, again, it goes back to making it people friendly, is actually, if you look at streets or squares or public realm where there's a lot of people and one where there isn't so many people, the difference is usually related to the idea of soft edges, but also people having a place to sit and stuff to look at. And I think where people don't have that invitation to pause, and where they don't have so many things to look at, people just won't stay there. So it starts to get more empty and so on. So I think those are just some of the ideas, kind of. That was a very scattergun answer, but I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
I think we're experiencing one of the joys of actually doing this online in a way that it doesn't happen in real life, because I think I've got a great comment of, like, curious spiky fences, they are not. So, you know, I think definitely there are lots of different points around boundaries that, you know, we have. I think, Peter, you talked earlier about the idea of taking away boundaries. And then, so someone's just said, railings are there for security. If free movement through the square is desired, then there will need to be other security devices. So there's something interesting about how you balance this, I guess, the philosophical idea of softening or reducing those boundaries with the notion of what we consider to be secure. So Peter, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Absolutely, and there are lots of things around boundaries. So boundaries are also demarcation land ownership as well. So that's quite often the main reason they're there. And I'm not suggesting that we remove all fences, because clearly you can't just have free, uninterrupted access across all points of the square. But I think we need to think differently about how people access places like Grosvenor Square or other parks, because quite often people actually need to walk quite a long way to get into a park, because they can't have easy access. You can also think about how you change the configuration of boundaries to change the way people leave the space as well, to encourage a different direction away from the space. So we tend to get trapped into thinking around how the space is currently configured, and that's the way it's always been. And actually it's not. It's usually, you know, what we know of in the last 20, 30 years. And again, going back to the example of Lend-Lease in Elephant Castle, they're reconfiguring some of the access points, not as access points, but as points of where you leave their space to point you towards another hidden space around the corner or down the road, to encourage a different pattern of movement. And most of our pattern of movement for the last 30, 40, 50 years has been dictated by avoiding cars and traffic. We can start rethinking that.
I mean, there are so many comments about boundaries that are interesting to pick up, about whether, you know, there's I think, Fahad, this was one of your images, the woodland image, where, like, is that an alternative? Somebody talking about, did Leicester Square originally have a wall around it? Like, what? And then some people say actually the notion of a boundary doesn't apply to the square. So it's really interesting.
Grosvenor Square had a wall at one stage. Yeah, it had a wall and then railings, and I mean, yeah. So now it has the hedge, which actually has a chain link fence that runs through it. which means that birds can't nest in it. So they've managed to sort of turn a green, what looks like a biodiverse, single species, and you can't nest in it because it's got a chain link fence through it.
I mean, Phillippa, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about this one around that balance of openness and security and safety, because I think so often when you get into like some of the fears around change or fears about any of our kind of public spaces, actually safety and security comes up so much, and we all want to feel safe in places, but it's somehow that balance of, oh, Ed's brought a dog in, somehow it's that balance of things being revealed, or how we kind of talk about I guess some of Fahad's language around what that edge is like, and the importance of people feeling like they can see things and it feels safe.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think I'd want to be asking, kind of having the conversations about secure from what, and what are the fears, and trying to really, in a safe space and in a kind of one that's very focused on listening and empathy, but to try and understand what people's concerns are, and try to dig a bit deeper into those, and kind of unpack them a bit more. I think another thing to think about edges is that if you're wanting to slow traffic on the areas around the park, then having it super open and having kind of an expectation that people can just walk out into the road is a really effective way of slowing traffic, and kind of blurring their edges, and trying to make it a more people-friendly space for everyone, especially prioritizing people walking and cycling. I think kind of we work in lots of locations, alleyways where people have been attacked, feel very unsafe, purchase illegal pepper sprays to just even and forced to move through them on a day-to-day basis. But I think kind of taking those people together on a journey, and really exploring and testing ideas in a low-cost way. So perhaps you have like a section of the park where you do remove the railings, you understand what happens, you sort of have different pilots and testing of different types of methods for different boundaries, and kind of learn together, and include people in that learning journey towards what does it mean for everyone, and how can we all feel secure and safe.
There's definitely so many more conversations that we can have about boundaries. There are lots of additional questions. There's, we're running out of time. I would say that there's certainly additional conversations that we want to have about heritage, and the balancing of the historic Mayfair and contemporary ideas about boundary and usability. I feel like we could do a whole big topic just on boundaries. It turns out it's something that people feel really passionate about, which is fantastic. But I would like to finish up by asking each of our panelists to say what they think the key lesson that they can take away from this evening's conversation for Grosvenor Square would be. An audience, at the same time, I'd really love for you to answer that question as well in the chat channel, so that we can capture your ideas and feedback into how we think about this redesign. Mine is that we need to have another conversation about boundaries. So Neil, I'm going to come to you first. What's your key takeaway?
Yeah, I agree with you about boundaries, and the kind of issue that relates to, that's quite interesting for me as well, is this idea of transition as people move through not just through the square, but actually from peripheral areas into the square or past the square. How that feels, the experience of, if you like, arriving at and departing from Grosvenor Square within that broader urban sort of fabric, I think is a really interesting thought to be thinking about. But I suppose my one plea is for, whatever happens with the redesign, for it to be ahead of the curve, for it to be resilient, to be meaningful, and to be purposeful and supported for the long term. Something which is a bold way of, if you like, signposting the future for other similar green spaces in similar parts of London. You have an opportunity here to be really innovative and really exciting, and to set a trend, I think. But it's not going to be easy. I know that from having participated in this forum and having looked at the questions and the chat. But thank you for inviting me to participate. It's been fascinating.
Thank you. Phillippa, what would be your big takeaway?
I think something around, yes, people want a space, a green space like this in the middle of a bustling city to be a haven, but what do people's havens look like? Yeah, all different, I imagine, but kind of understanding and exploring that question from like lots of different perspectives. And also a plea, I guess, in the same way Neil had a plea, to really design with and for future generations. So kind of how can we include the voice really strongly of kind of, you know, under 14-year-olds in the kind of growing conversation around this, and definitely in terms of around climate change and growing, and sort of including their young people's passion for that in this space.
Fantastic, thank you. Fahad.
Yeah, I think just to conclude, I guess I was really inspired by some of the ideas we discussed around kind of the human scale and how to make spaces more inviting and more friendly. And I think the kind of points on boundary, I largely agree with as well. I think just to conclude, I went to this lecture ages ago, and I can't remember who did the lecture, what it was about, but I remember the story the lecturer told, and it was a story about a housing development which is suffering from a lot of crime, to go back to the idea of security. And what they did was they introduced a flower shop. And the only condition was that the flower shop had to open, I think, 7 days a week and so on. And what they found was actually the crime went right down because there was always a pair of eyes there. So I think, just to conclude on that point, I think our ideas around security and boundary, those things can be actually as much psychological as they are physical. And I think we can start thinking in those terms a little bit. But yeah, I think that's all I have.
Fantastic, thank you, Fahad. Peter.
I think for me, it's about how the redesign of Grosvenor Square influences the design and planning and design of the public space beyond its boundaries. Because it could be a catalytic project, and it needs to have an influence beyond its immediate boundaries.
Fantastic. And Ed, we'll see whether Ed can follow the rules and do one takeaway point. Try, Ed.
Oh, okay. So I think I'm going to put the access via the roads to one side, because I think we all know that it's not good enough. And think about the movement within the square and how you create a space that enables people to use the square, you know, to its utmost, but how that balances with nature, and how, you know, you create spaces to linger and pause, but also facilitates people to move through it quickly as they may need to, and how there's a lot of challenges. Luckily, we have a fantastic design team that Fahad will solve these questions for us.
No pressure.
You're going to be great, Fahad. It's going to be great. Okay, this has been so good. It's been really great to kind of have all these different discussions and ideas from people. I wanted to plug a couple of events that we've got coming up. We have got a local conversation actually about accessing the outdoors, which is coming up on Saturday, or you can also come on Tuesday, so that there's going to be much more detailed conversation. So if you want to join in the boundary chat, that's your moment. And we'll be able to talk a bit more with Tonkin Lou about some of the ideas or approaches that they might have. And then we also have our next big topic talk is about spectacular horticulture and biodiversity. So I know that there were some questions in the chat about this, and so we're going to put a link in the chat to book in for the Eventbrite to come along to that. That is 2 weeks today. So thank you to all of our panelists, thank you to Ed, thank you audience, and I really hope that you can join us at one of our upcoming events and carry on this conversation about Grosvenor Square. So You've got the website up there where you can find out the upcoming events. You can follow us on Instagram, on Twitter, and there's also an email up there if you have got additional comments, thoughts, ideas. Please get involved and join in the conversation. Thank you so much. And we did it all exactly on time. So finishing bang on 6:30. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining.
Thank you, guys. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.